Welcome to episode 5 of The Culinary Citizen, a gastronomic guide to international relations. This is Sam Chappell-Sokol.
And Kelsey Marr. Each week we introduce you to a concept or theme connecting food and people around the world. This week we are giving you updates of culinary diplomacy programs in the news around the world.
Our discussion with Alessandro Reversi a couple of weeks ago gave us some insight into some major events of 2015, including the meeting of Le Club des Chefs and the Milan Expo. But now it's a good time to discuss some recent news stories that have come to our attention. Kelsey, want to start us off?
So, going through the news, we came across Culinary Diplomacy of Ethiopia. The news source is from All Africa, and the author of the article, although not a part of the government, she calls for the institutionalization of culinary diplomacy in Ethiopia by the government, and she acknowledges the diaspora, how they have created a culinary diplomacy of Ethiopian food. She cites Twitter and magazines, including a magazine from California, talking about Ethiopian foods in different regions around the world. And she's just calling for a government to create a more organized program.
Calling for the government to create a more organized culinary diplomacy, gastrodiplomacy initiative. Actually, the Twitter account that she cited was Paul Rockauer, who we've had on the program before. And Paul on our show actually called for stronger gastrodiplomacy, culinary diplomacy initiatives coming out of African countries. He spent a lot of time traveling there for his hip-hop diplomacy program with State. And I agree. I love Ethiopian food. I think it's one of the only sub-Saharan African cuisines that is widely known, at least in the United States. Yes, I lived in DC for a while, and there's a huge Ethiopian migrant population or immigrant population, but also in San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area, and all around the world, there are Ethiopian immigrants who have started their communities focused on food.
And Ethiopian food in DC was part of your conflict cuisine course, right?
Exactly. So we discussed, this is a course I ran with Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman, who we'll have on air in the coming weeks or months. We focused on history of conflict taught through food. And one of the conflicts we talked about was the 80s and 90s in Ethiopia, as well as late 90s, I guess, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and how refugee communities left Ethiopia to escape conflict. Many of them came to Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., and set up some amazing restaurants. And we talked with a couple of chefs, a couple academics, and some officials about how food has become a tool of community building in the Ethiopian diaspora community in D.C. So definitely a lot of room for government work to be done, kind of akin to the work being done in Peru by the Peruvian government. We'll be speaking in a couple of weeks with a member of the Peruvian, a new council created to promote Peruvian gastrodiplomacy initiatives all around the world. Also, work being done in Thailand.
But I think this is pretty interesting when we're seeing the diaspora come to a new country, set up shops, and it becomes accepted by the local population. I'm wondering if this is going to become a trend, or is a trend we can see in history of culinary diplomacy in regards futuristically to the Syrian refugees and where they are repopulating.
Great question. I do think that when we looked at the conflict cuisines class, we were thinking this was earlier on in the Syrian civil war, and we were hoping to bring some Syrian chefs into the discussion, but it was difficult. It's been difficult since 9/11, when our immigration policies were really clamped down. There were not a lot of refugee populations coming to America from that part of the world and setting up communities. So with potentially a new influx of Syrian refugees, we'll see if there are culinary communities sprouting up across the country and to see the effect of that.
Right. And this could be a really innovative way for countries who have suffered conflict as they're rebuilding and looking at their population, not only in country, but outside of country, to kind of build their tourism and economic prosperity through culinary diplomacy by reaching out to diaspora who are in different countries and already having that acceptance in those local countries for tourism back to the home country.
That's a fascinating idea. In post-conflict reconstruction, I studied some conflict resolution and post-conflict stuff in grad school, and definitely in post-conflict reconstruction, it's hard to rebuild things like a tourism industry when there's still some fear or less infrastructure to support that. But looking at countries that have gone through conflict and capitalizing on something like culinary nation branding, that would be kind of a fascinating way to bring people back to your shores. So something interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Staying on the topic of culinary nation branding, we've seen some news, a little bit vague news out of Thailand, that they're starting a new project started by the Thailand Research Fund, who's commissioned a team of young, talented researchers to curate a creative movement, not just around food. There's been a food campaign for about 15 years, Thai Kitchen to the World and the Thai Global Brand. But now they're combining it with visual arts and performing arts, as well as the kind of artisan food movement, to build this living interpretation of what Thai-ness is, what does it mean to be Thai, and encouraging tourism and trade through this interdisciplinary approach.
Yeah, this is fascinating if you take a look at the article published by Travel Daily News. It was published quite recently, November 30th. And the pictures that you see, the article kind of goes into explaining the ritualistic aspect of food making and how they incorporate that into movement. And so just like looking at the photos, you see women dancing with what looks like rice. And so I just think that's quite interesting how this is a new and innovative level of culinary diplomacy that we haven't really seen yet. At least I haven't.
Right. And when we think of cultural diplomacy initiatives, we split it down these tracks. There's dance diplomacy, there's music diplomacy, now there's culinary diplomacy. But there's not a lot of mixing of those things. So to have a culinary / dance diplomacy movement, it's pretty innovative, pretty cool. We'll see where that goes.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. Thailand has always been an innovator for this field, culinary diplomacy. So it'll be really interesting to see how that is perceived in the assessment after a couple of years of implementing this project. Are tourists interested in not only experiencing the food through their palate, but also visually? And is that something they can kind of hone in on a specialization of tourism?
Yeah, definitely. Moving across the world to a bit of an embattled place, let's talk a little bit about France. Before the really horrific attacks in Paris, I've been discussing for a few months, both on my blog, and we discussed this briefly on the podcast a few weeks ago, about a culinary nationalism movement going on in France, and how the French president and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are co-opting the world of food to repatriate. There's been some attacks on French food in recent press the past couple of years, saying that French food has lost its heart and soul. So the government has taken on trying to bring back food into the state and say, we are the French. French food is very important to us, and we are very proud of that. So I saw a news story tweeted by Guillaume Gomez, who is the chef of the president, of French President Hollande. He tweeted this back in early November about how President Hollande is trying to eat 100% French, and that the Élysée, the palace that the president lives in, has started their own kitchen garden. So now they're getting their own tomatoes, their own eggplants, and that the French president is really trying to eat only French products. So that's interesting. I mean, I don't think that very many heads of state solely eat the products from their own country. I think that there's so much globalization and cross-pollination of cultures and cuisines that it's difficult to do that, but we'll see how that goes.
In related news to President Francois Hollande, earlier this month, the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, was making a landmark trip to Europe. And apparently, Francois Hollande and him had a dispute over what was going to be served at the different meals when Rouhani visited France. And so Rouhani was saying, I want every meal to be halal with no wine. And the French came back with, well, let's have an alcohol-free breakfast, which Rouhani then responded, that seems too cheap.
Right.
And so it's really interesting how two heads of state and their counterparts discuss what will be served at a diplomatic dinner. Our source, The Guardian, as well as The Washington Post, had some interesting things to say about the forming of a diplomatic dinner, especially when it comes to the difficulties of planning a dinner, including the food choices as well as the seating arrangement and all the things you have to think about. It's not just the food, but when it comes to the seating arrangement, you have to think about who's sitting next to each other, what's their rank, what's their position, and are their countries talking to each other? Because all of that will be documented by the media, of course, and then what kind of message does that send?
And this French-Iranian food fight is fascinating. I was kind of nerding out about it and reading a lot of what was going on Twitter. This news came out in the days before the attacks in Paris, so quickly fell off importance. This is not important in light of that. But in the days before, it was pretty big news because Iran's president was making his first trip to Europe, first trip of a head of state of Iran to Europe in 10 years. Mm-hmm. So if you were to have a meal with Hollande, it would signal some sort of rapprochement. And the fact that they disagreed, who knows what this is signaling deeper, but the fact that they disagreed over the menu is significant. Some people responded that the Iranians were in the right. They have religious obligations to meet, and that the French should respect that. Other folks said, this is on French turf. Why wouldn't the French serve non-halal meats? Why wouldn't the French serve wine at their own dinner? A lot of very impassioned responses to this little food fight. And I don't know. Kelsey, what do you think about it?
Well, I was also reading at the Washington Post. They were agreeing with the Islamic code where, this is a religious issue. But then they also acknowledge that France is this, I guess, symbol of secular ideals and holding that above all else. So the article really narrowed it down to secularism versus religiosity, which I thought was fascinating. But I kind of understand where they're coming from when you're hosting your own dinner party. You do have to kind of mitigate the issues of, do you serve wine if there are people who don't drink wine or alcohol in general, or if there are people who have certain religious restrictions? Specifically, I'm thinking of people who practice Judaism. Do you serve pork? I think if the president of Israel came, would he have the same issue with France of hey, I don't eat pork?
Right. It's a good question. I was thinking about this in terms of diplomacy theory, calling upon some of my study. And there's a concept called the two-level game, which was invented or thought up by Robert Putnam, the political scientist. And looking at each negotiation or each discussion, you can't just look at the two major players. You can't just look at Rouhani and Hollande. You have to look at each of their sides. So Hollande has a huge group of people to satisfy. He has to satisfy his own cabinet. He has to satisfy the elected officials who are under him, as well as his people. Same with Rouhani. And they both have very diverse populaces, very diverse citizenry. There's radicals, there's liberals on both sides. So the fact that Rouhani is making this landmark trip to Europe, by doing that, he's already pissing some people off. And furthermore, he can't go to a meal and be seen surrounded by glasses of wine, because then he challenges his own authority back at home. Same with Hollande. There's a huge right-wing movement in France that's pushing back against the quote-unquote Islamization, also called these days kebabization, which I think we can discuss on a future episode, how there have been bans on kebab shops, on new kebab shops in the post-Paris attacks world. So we can talk about that as a form of culinary diplomacy at a later date. But each of these presidents have a huge challenge to appear strong. And in this negotiation, nobody was willing to back down. The French suggested this breakfast. When you're being offered a state dinner and then you're offered a continental breakfast, that, it not as impressive, not as important. You can see why the Iranians reacted as they did. So interesting stuff. Just to quote a couple tweets, some funny stuff. The American Department of Defense official Andrew Exum, who was tweeting on his own behalf, not for the Department of Defense, wrote, "Good for France, cultural sensitivity cuts both ways, and in general, the home team should set the rules." It's one opinion. A writer, Borzu Daragahi of BuzzFeed, writes, "Oh, come on, at Francois Hollande. For sake of diplomacy, forego wine for a night. Think of it as avoiding empty calories."
Well, yeah, I was thinking maybe they could do like sparkling
think of it
water.
Right. Think of it as a moment for innovation. I don't know.
Yeah.
If I were the French officials, I know that there's so much going on, but I would have seen it as a moment for creativity.
Right. And I'm sure there are like regional juices or, certain regional drinks that are not alcoholic that they could have served and really highlighted and featured maybe to a new market that would have opened up.
Right. You could see this as a commerce, trade, tourism issue if you say, hey, the French have a variety of really cool Syrah juices. Syrah originally is from the city of Shiraz in Iran. If instead of serving Syrah wine, you serve a Syrah juice from the Rhone region, you create this cool inter-regional connection between the Rhone and Shiraz, Iran. And who knows? Who knows? But nobody's paying us to host meals for the French, so.
Well, it looks like the tour has been postponed, so maybe if anyone's listening out there, they could take some notes.
Monsieur Four, Ambassador Four, if you're listening, maybe you can serve some Syrah juice next time President Rouhani comes to town.
Definitely.
Okay, let's move on, shall we? Getting a little bit closer to home. Both Kelsey and I live in California, and recently we've seen a new cookbook by Dr. Luz Calvo and Catriona Rueda Esquivel, both professors in the Bay Area. They have started a new movement about decolonizing your diet. What does that mean, Kelsey?
The book promises that food is medicine and that the authors share information about the health benefits of ancestral foods from Mexico, and both women have ties to Mexico. It seems like both their grandmothers used to serve quote-unquote traditional dishes to Californians when they arrived from Mexico. And they're really just like going back and looking at the energizing, healing properties of a plant-based Mexican-American diet.
So when we're talking about Mexican-American, we're also talking about the word decolonization. And what I gathered from this was a movement to bring back foods, ingredients that were pre-Columbian, pre-1492, pre-exposure to Europe. So it's focusing on a much more plant-based.
It's a vegetarian cookbook.
It's a vegetarian cookbook, I guess, completely plant-based diet that has no influence from the Western world, from the colonial world, and it's a way not only to eat more healthily. This obviously is a health cookbook, but it also is spiritually healthy and culturally healthy in that you're bringing back traditions. It's like a completely different variation on paleo, because paleo is supposed to bring back way ancestral cuisines before agriculturalism. This is bringing back a cultural tradition or a culinary tradition before the introduction of Western European colonial traditions and ingredients.
Yeah, this is actually really fascinating. The inspiration for this book came when Dr. Lewis was diagnosed in 2006 with cancer. And so she really looked towards food and what she was putting in her body as a way of treatment. this is really interesting to me because I've been following this movement of cancer treatment that really became popular with Chris Carr's documentary entitled Crazy Sexy Cancer, where she forewent traditional chemotherapy treatment for a plant-based diet and tried tons of different ways to really find a nutritious, holistic approach to living with cancer. And so I think this is very interesting. However, just to play devil's advocate, I'd like to point out how charged the word decolonization could seem.
Yeah, it is charged. I think when you talk about colonialization or colonialism, and you talk about occupation type of language, it is charged, but I don't think that's bad, and I don't think it's negative. I do think that there's room for discussion like this all around the world. There's been a huge history of colonialism all around the world. I'm fascinated by the effect of colonialism and colonization on cuisine. I've written about how the French influenced Vietnamese cuisine. You know, we wouldn't have the banh mi if we didn't have baguettes in Vietnam. The banh mi is really just a Vietnamization of a French sandwich. The Portuguese spread a cuisine from Brazil to Angola to Goa in southwestern India that they share so many interesting similarities all around the world because of the colonial influence. But it's good and bad, I guess. Like, Brazilian food is really complex, really rich because of the colonial influence. But it would be interesting. I don't know, healthy. I don't know, nourishing culturally if Brazil went back to a pre-Portuguese diet, or if India went to a diet without the influence of British colonialism, or if the Vietnamese went to a diet without French colonialism. It's an interesting thought experiment, and it has to do with your relationship with you, meaning your country, your people, your relationship with your pre-colonial or with your colonial occupier.
Right.
It's interesting. I don't have any judgment of this. I just think it's an interesting thought, a thought experiment to consider your diet without the influence of colonialism.
I mean, like, looking at the website a little bit, it's really interesting, and I think it's because of they're choosing decolonization to round up the U.S.-born Latina community or Latino community, which is very important because it's one of the populations that suffers the most from obesity. And I think that's what they're really calling for is, on their website, they say, "We believe that it is time to reclaim our cultural inheritance and wean our bodies from sugary drinks, fast food, and donuts. It's difficult to fight for our people and our culture if we are sick and sluggish." So it seems more of like a call to band people together.
I don't know a whole lot about this, and I'd love to learn more, but there's a huge concern in the Native American or American Indian population about how a modern diet has made it one of the least healthy, most obese populations in America, because there's just not a lot of access to, there's a lot of food deserts in those areas and in reservation areas. And that's certainly a community that could benefit from this kind of decolonizing your diet movement to say, like, let's go back to an earlier, if they can, if it's even possible, let's go back to an earlier way of eating that is pre McDonald's, pre like the way that many folks are forced to eat because of economic situations at this point. So I think this cookbook and this concept can go beyond the Mexican American community and maybe can affect a wider selection of, or wider group of folks all around the country and all around the world.
Yeah, I see it as really questioning the American food system. We have to kind of put an umbrella statement on it. So in more international news, Melbourne, Australia had an interesting multicultural cook-off recently at the beginning of the month of November, where chefs from different specialties and backgrounds, including Jewish cooking, Muslim cooking, Italian, and Greek. They were all invited to this multicultural cook-off, and then when they got there, they were told to cook each other's recipes. And for some chefs, they were very successful, and for other chefs, it was traumatic, including a melted sieve.
So a little bit of context, these were the museum chefs. These are the chefs who cooked for each of their communities' museums. So there's like the Jewish Australian Museum, and their chef went and competed at this thing and ended up making an Arabic sweet and poured some like molten hot semolina through a plastic sieve, and that did not turn out well.
From the advice of the peanut crowd.
Right, yeah. the well-meaning onlookers. But all in all, it seemed like a fun event, cool multiculturalism, a cool way for each of these communities to learn more about each other. It reminds me of an event I went to in DC a couple times called the Embassy Chef Challenge, which pitted each of the embassy chefs against each other for this big gala. So each chef would put together a dish or two of their cuisine, and then both a panel of judges as well as the public would vote on which of these cuisines was best. But I love the twist of this Melbourne cook-off that they had to cook each other's dishes. So if they did an Embassy Chef Challenge that the Italian chef had to cook, Trinidadian food, and the Namibian chef had to cook French food, and the Japanese chef had to cook American food, I wonder, the challenge is not only your chops as a chef, but also your awareness of other cuisines, as well as, I think it was the Italian chef who had to cook Greek food in this challenge, who said that, we have a similar dish in our cuisine, we just use a different kind of bean. Right. And I wonder what other sort of cross-culinary connections would be made if a wider group were to take part in this sort of exchange.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. We see it with the International Alert program, Recipes for Peace, where home cooks are exchanging recipes. But this was really like in the moment, in the heat of the kitchen, where chefs had to really test their skills and knowledge. I'm sure they were probably Googling some stuff if they could.
Yeah, on their phones. Yeah. Brief aside about multiculturalism and cooking shows. The Great British Bake Off ended in the past month, the most recent season. And it was won for the first time by a British Muslim. The Great British Bake Off is like one of the most popular TV shows in all of Britain, which is so cool. And it's a fascinating show. It's really intriguing because it brings home cooks, home bakers from all around the country together to show off their baking chops, and some very, very impressive folks do that. The winner of this year's season was a British Muslim woman, a home baker. Her story brought everybody together in the country, and that's a really cool. It's not culinary diplomacy per se. It's just the fact that in such a politically charged environment, to have this woman bring the whole country together over like pastry, it was just a nice story.
Right.
And finally, in American culinary diplomacy news, we have a couple of stories from chefs who've traveled or have hosted culinary diplomacy programs. Chef Naomi Pomeroy of the restaurant Beast in Portland, who has traveled, I believe, to Myanmar, Burma, with the culinary diplomacy program, the State Department program. She hosted a Colombian film crew in Portland. They discussed the power of food in diplomacy. Hopefully we can catch that program on Colombian TV someday. We also heard from former pastry chef of the White House, Bill Yassis, who traveled to Uzbekistan recently. Don't know much more about that. Saw some awesome photos on Facebook. I think in one of them he was actually riding a camel. In another, he was eating sambusa. So maybe we'll learn more about that someday. So that's about all the time we have today for The Culinary Citizen. We look forward to being with you again next week. We'll be speaking with Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman, professor and scholar in residence at American University in Washington, D.C. She'll be talking about her conflict cuisines class. In coming weeks, we'll also be talking to Bill Yassis, the pastry chef of the White House, and hopefully be chatting with Jesper Volmer, as promised, the chef of the Royal Houses of Denmark. So we hope you'll join us for all of those, and look forward to it.
Until then.